Council. Our next speaker is going to be Paul Griffin. Paul Griffin currently works for the Bureau of Land Management as our Wild Horse and Burro Research Coordinator. He was formerly with USGS. And today he's going to talk a little bit about management considerations for wild horses and burros, and I think it should be fascinating. So thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Karen. Well, we've been talking about restoration and conservation, and the bottom line, I hope you all walk out with this simple message today, and that is that wild horse and burro management can complicate habitat restoration. Before I go on, I want to acknowledge my co-authors from the BLM, the Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, and the University of Wyoming. Now, if you're interested, I'm going to be reviewing a lot of other papers that I researched that I didn't myself conduct, and so I have a stack of papers up here in the front summarizing those papers that I'll refer to. So if you're interested, come and get one of these after the talk. For people who are online, you can contact me directly, and I can get you this list. So what I hope you leave with from this presentation is that protecting wild horses and burros is important, social and legally, on designated public lands, that large herd sizes tend to have negative consequences for rangeland ecosystems, that much of the area that's inhabited by wild horses and burros has relatively low resilience and resistance, and that habitat restoration is really unlikely to succeed unless there are safeguards to limit those wild horse and burro numbers. Now, I know that many of you who work in the West have seen these effects firsthand, and I know we could have some really lively conversations after this talk about everyone's observations. Well, the horses and burros whose unbranded and unclaimed ancestors were present on BLM and Forest Service lands in 1971 have a specific legal status of wild, as defined by the Wild Free-Roaming Horses and Burros Act, which I'm going to call the Act. And those animals are protected from harassment and from capture unless it's part of their federal management. On the other hand, there are some other feral horses who live on tribal, state, or federal lands that don't have the same protections, even if some people might refer to them as wild horses. The Act also requires that the BLM and the Forest Service maintain a thriving natural ecological balance in support of our multiple use missions. So the BLM considers wild horses and burros to be comparable to other resource values, such as native wildlife or cultural and historic sites and watershed services. So in some cases, the agency has to make decisions about how to weigh those competing values. BLM has 177 herd management areas, or HMAs. The Forest Service has 34 active wild burro territories, wild horse territories, or wild horse and burro territories. And these HMAs and territories range in size from 3 square miles to over 2,000 square miles. But the key thing is that the federal protections go with the animal, as they can roam outside of those designated areas and they are still protected. So wild horse management really is mainly limited to managing the numbers of animals. They live on the range year-round. Their grazing is not regulated, unlike what we just heard about with livestock grazing, and so you can't control them quite as well. Each HMA or territory has an established target population range known as the Appropriate Management Level, or AML, and the assumption is that AML should allow for land health standards to be met and allow for that thriving natural ecological balance. AML is usually determined from site-specific analysis with 3 to 5 years of in-depth monitoring data and land health assessment, and then it's set through a public NEPA process. But herds can grow 15 to 25% per year. And so if the number of wild horses is at AML, and there are measures to keep it at AML to limit that population's growth rate, then wild horse use across the landscape might be distributed enough that a restoration project could achieve habitat quality goals. And the best outcomes would be in cases where the landscape has not crossed a transition into a lower quality state, like what Dr. Beck was just showing in that last presentation. Well, on Tuesday, there was a great symposium about new research into wild horse ecological effects, and Bob Hopper and John Roos spoke about the opportunities and the constraints to wild horse and burro management. So I'm just going to recap very briefly. The number of wild horses and burros on the range on BLM and Forest Service lands is more than 3 times AML, this appropriate management level. It's more than 80,000 last spring or so, and another 12,000 foals by now. There's over 43,000 unadopted animals and currently maintained in off-range holdings just by BLM at an annual cost of nearly $50 million. So that does not leave a lot of money to do removals or fertility control. So these herds on the range keep on growing. In fact, they can grow more than 20% per year. For almost all herds, predation is not a limiting factor, and that's partly because horses tend to prefer open habitats. There are other reasons. There are some available fertility control vaccines, but they really just slow down the growth rate at best. The most commonly used vaccine has to be re-injected every year. So it only really works well if you start by having the population down at appropriate management level. BLM is responsible to maintain that appropriate management level by removals or some other means, such as fertility control. The Act calls for humane destruction of unadoptable animals. And the 2005 Burns Amendment actually directed BLM to sell animals without limitation that have been offered for adoption 3 times or are over 10 years old. But the BLM has been also maintain a policy consistent with congressional direction to prohibit the sale of animals without limitation or their destruction from 1988 to 2004 and then from 2010 to the present. And also the Forest Service does not now destroy any healthy animals. Well, many studies support the general conclusion that overabundant wild horse populations can lead to really significant changes on rangeland. On Tuesday's symposium, a number of talks reviewed recent developments. I'm just going to review them in general terms. In 2011, Beaver and Aldridge made a conceptual model of those effects of wild horses on sagebrush ecosystems, and they inferred that there are a lot of mainly negative consequences of wild horse presence with regards to sage grouse habitat, and it's particularly nesting, success, and survival. Again, the assumption, though, that we work off is that herds that are at appropriate management level will allow for healthy riparian and upland rangeland habitats. So most of these studies have had either, they've compared places with horses to places without horses. But animal density, that continuous measure, is really an important covariate. Most of the studies that I'm going to review today have not included that covariate as a continuous measure, although Ziegenfuss et al. Did find that horse biomass increased, plant biomass growth decreased. They were negatively correlated. Well, horses can digest high volumes of low-quality forage, so they can persist longer than native wildlife in many cases, even as resource levels get more and more depleted. Horse presence is generally associated with greater relative abundance and cover of grazing-tolerant, unpalatable, and invasive plant species, including cheatgrass, shown here. At the same time, horses are also associated with lower overall plant cover, lower native plant cover, lower shrub cover, lower overall plant biomass, and lower species richness. They can spread exotic invasive plant species through their feces. And although horses are generally considered to be grazers, they can eat sagebrush itself, at least in the Great Basin in summer. That's been shown. And of course, they can damage sagebrush through trampling. Horses can have especially severe impacts on aquatic ecosystems and riparian communities. But again, you know, as with all these impacts, the real question is, what is the population size? What's the herd size of horses relative to the resources that are out there? Horses need a lot of water. individuals can drink more than 7 gallons per day on average, and they routinely commute long distances between water sources and palatable forage. We were just talking today about a herd that's known to move 12 miles a day. 10 or more miles a day has been recorded with GPS collars. But for sure, the closer the distance is to waters that horses use, the more the grazing pressure should be expected. So, if you're planning a restoration project in any area that has wild horses nearby, and when I say nearby, that means 10, 12 miles easily, you may need to consider some form of fencing to prevent those horses from hammering that restoration project. But if you do fence a water source, you also might need to provide a measure so that that horses can access water from that source, such as running a pipe to an external trough. Now again with water, wild horses have been shown to displace native ungulates at water sources. This can be especially problematic during droughts. This picture here from Perry et al. Shows a cow elk that was kept away from this water source at Mesa Verde National Park for at least a whole day while those horses just camped out on the water. But the lesson here, again, it's that horse herds need to be kept at levels that are as close as possible to that appropriate management level that allows for a thriving natural ecological balance and allows for other values such as native wildlife and hunting, which are important departmental priorities. So as again, with all these impacts, it's a question of how many horses are there relative to the resource. Horses can limit reseeding success in restoration projects. After summer wildfire, this area in Oregon's Kiger herd management area, it was drill seeded in December 2011 with crested wheatgrass and native perennial grasses. Now, most of the horses in that area, thank you, had been removed ahead of time, but others had migrated back in the spring. When they came back, they concentrated their use in this reseeded area. They plucked seedlings, they trampled extensively, and they prevented seed head production. They also pulled up plastic cages in this bitterbrush seedlings that had been planted in April 2012. So all of these effects happened really with horses at appropriate management level or close to it, that at a very relatively low density. Again, the message is any restoration project with horses nearby within, let's say, 5-10 miles unfenced from that area of water source that horses use will definitely be subject to potential impacts at that restoration site. So any restoration project has to have a clear plan with dedicated funding ahead of time to get horses down to that appropriate management level and to keep them there. But you have to keep in mind that even at the appropriate management level, the restoration projects could face this type of, could be an attraction to horses. There are some other habitat effects, other measurable differences between areas with horses as compared to without horses. Soil compaction and soil erosion have been found to be worse in areas with horses. Some studies, but not all, have found that invertebrates, small mammals, and reptile communities were less diverse. And so all these results suggest that horse presence can have broad effects on ecosystem functioning. Now, I'm not going to talk about them today, but wild burros can also have impacts on rangelands that are similar to wild horses. They can affect riparian habitats and upland habitats, native wildlife, and they're otherwise very similar. I'm not going to address them today. There are also some areas, unfortunately, where the number of horses so far outstripped and depleted the resources that the horses themselves are starving. And there's this pretty unpleasant picture here from the upper left. That's from an area near Las Vegas where BLM had to remove starving horses. At the time, that horse population was upwards of 7 times the appropriate management level. And, you know, BLM has to respond to these kinds of emergencies as much as we're able to, but unfortunately, these types of situations may become more and more common as the herd sizes continue to increase over greater and greater areas across the West. Now, I've said it a couple times, horses range widely. But anybody who looks at maps of wild horse and burro distributions or these boundary administrative units, the herd management areas and the territories, you have to keep in mind, you have to be aware that the horses can range far outside those boundaries. For example, here are each of these dots was a waypoint, an observation point where where the survey crew saw a group of wild horses on an aerial survey on in Northern California on the Modoc Plateau. This is the Devil's Garden Wild Horse Territory, Forest Service lands, and nearby Round Mountain BLM lands. So the polygons, those green polygons, show that the boundaries of the territory, but you can see that there are horses distributed far beyond those boundaries, outside the designated area. So again, bringing it back to restoration projects, even if your project area is outside of a herd management area or outside of a wild horse territory, you still need to consider the distribution of the animals themselves and their potential herd growth of any nearby herd. And generally, at least for federally protected wild horses, the best people to ask or the best people to turn to know what is the distribution of horses in my area is going to be your BLM wild horse and burro specialists who are working on the ground and know the horses and where they're roaming, or the Forest Service range biologists who have a similar job. Okay, so now I want to turn to our spatial analysis relative to resilience and resistance. So first, in this first slide, we categorized wild horse herd densities with respect to this appropriate management levels. Now, I should say we limited the analysis here to areas in the sage-grouse management zones. You can access this map on the USGS Science Base website, as well as the other maps. We categorized this horse densities based on the March 2017 herd sizes relative to appropriate management level. So if an area was within that AML, it's shown here in blue. If it was between 100% and 200% of AML, it's shown in yellow. And if it's more than twice as large as AML, more than 200%, it's shown in red here. And you can see most of the areas are yellow and red, at least at this time. Very few have herd sizes that are at that target size of blue. There's also a few areas shown in gray here, and those are BLM administrative units called herd areas. There aren't supposed to be horses there, but in this case there are, and the ones that are in gray do have horses. Okay, then we asked, within those herd management areas and territories that have horses, what's the distribution of those three resilience and resistance categories that we've been hearing about? In this slide, the blue colors are the highest resilience and resistance values, with deeper shades of blue showing more and more horse densities. Again, most of these areas are yellow or red, yellow showing the medium resilience and resistance, and red the high resilience and red the low resilience and resistance, not so good. And what you can see, just focusing in on Nevada in particular, it has a lot of area with low resilience and resistance, but very high horse densities with respect to AML. So those are the areas with the darkest red. So if you were going to do a restoration project in these in areas with the darkest red, you'd already have a hard time because the plants would be facing a not a very favorable moisture regime. And then you add to that a high number of horses, and it's just make the project more difficult. In contrast, Wyoming does have a pretty big swath of moderate or medium resilience and resistance lands where you might expect projects to take well, but those do have really high horse densities. So if you wanted to improve the prospects of restoration there, you would want to remove and reduce the number of horses for the long term before you do your project. Now I want to turn to sage-grouse breeding habitat. In this slide, which is just zoomed in on Nevada, the blue is for the highest quality breeding habitat, and the shades of blue show the the density of horses, with the darker being higher density. So the darkest blue would be the highest quality sage-grouse habitat, but with high density of horses. Those could be good places to prioritize horse removals or fertility control, if you can keep the herds down at that appropriate management level. And then the yellows are the medium quality habitat, again with the darker the yellow, the higher the horse density. So you can use this type of a layer along with the other layers that Zach Bowen presented to figure out how to prioritize areas for restoration. But this is also showing that how you got to prioritize your horse removals. Well, we all know how prized and valued wild horses and burros are, and we in the BLM and Forest Service understand our responsibility to keep them and the public lands they support healthy and sustainable. I hope that this review just demonstrated that areas with herds at appropriate management levels tend to be better candidates for restoration projects. I know we're getting close on time, so I'll stop now and take one quick question. Yes? So AML is set at the local level, and there are measures of the health of the rangelands relative to the various multiple uses that are used for that range, and the AML is set to allow for some level of herd growth. It's got a low end and a high end, and ideally if horse herd population size is somewhere between that low and high end, and then accounting for all the other multiple uses that we're charged to maintain, such as livestock grazing, which is, of course, a protected value, and native wildlife, and many others, then land health standards should be met.
Is that updated frequently, or what's the process for keeping that up to date?
Yeah, that process is through public involvement through a NEPA process.
Thank you.
Thank you.